What would you do if you woke up tomorrow and the global economy had simply stopped? No warning, no gradual decline, no time to prepare. Only a silent, overwhelming void where every financial system once existed. It's a scenario many prefer not to imagine, but stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Imagine opening your phone and seeing all the world's stock markets frozen in the same image. Locked charts, red indicators, urgent broadcasts announcing the simultaneous collapse of the largest financial institutions. The first reaction isn't fear. It's disbelief. Have you ever experienced this? That moment when your mind tries to fill the silence with logical answers, but everything seems to disconnect at once? Now amplify that feeling to a planetary scale. In the first hours of this global economy, what if the collapse wouldn't behave like a typical disaster? There would be no smoke, explosions, or sirens, just the invisible failure system that sustained billions of lives. Digital banks down, payments denied, supply chains disrupted. The global economy always seems solid, but in reality, it functions as a network of codes, contracts, trust, and synchronization. When one link breaks, the others follow. When they all break at the same time, a new crisis is born to alter an economy in real time, improvised, unstable, and inevitably chaotic. In the first 24 hours of this economic simulation, humanity would face something unprecedented. A total reset, a complete shutdown of the financial mechanisms that shape behaviors, nations, and daily decisions. Can you imagine what it would be like to live without the structure that organizes every purchase, every salary, every shipment on global routes? What once seemed automatic, energy, supplies, transportation, suddenly becomes uncertain. And this uncertainty spreads faster than any crisis we have ever witnessed. People scramble to secure basic resources. Companies try to operate without price references. Governments compete for information. Try and understand if the failure is temporary, intentional, or irreversible. Trust, the invisible element that sustains the entire global macroeconomy, evaporates. And it is in this vacuum that the first signs of reorganization emerge. Some try to recreate small local exchange systems. Others turn to digital communities in the hope that some decentralized AI is still functioning. The truth is that, faced with sudden collapse, everyone starts to seek the same goal: to understand how to rebuild a world without the old financial map. Stay with me until the end, because we're only just beginning to explore the scenario. What happens after these first 24 hours could redefine the global order in ways few imagine. And as we move forward in the simulation, you'll see how every decision, every reaction, and every attempt at adaptation paves the way for a future completely different from the one we know. And as we move through this initial impact, something important begins to emerge. The collective realization that we are not just observing an economic collapse. We are witnessing how humanity reacts when the world loses its most basic coordinates. This type of scenario awakens memories, fears, and even intuitions that many have already felt in lesser moments of uncertainty. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far, because each perspective adds new layers to this economic simulation, and their perspective can help others understand this alternate future that we are exploring together. As you follow this journey, your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. People who may never have stopped to imagine what a social media platform/channel would be like. Global economy, what if happening in real time? When you like this video, the algorithm understands that this topic matters. When you comment, it comes to life. And when you subscribe, you signal that you want to continue following scenarios that investigate not only collapses, but possibilities, reorganizations, and alternative futures that may shape the world we are about to face. So, if this experience brought any insight, any feeling, any thought that resonated within you, please share it. And if you want to follow each new development in these global economic simulations, consider subscribing. This not only strengthens the community, but ensures you'll be here when we explore the next lines of this alternative timeline. Because as those first 24 hours unfold, something bigger begins to happen beneath the surface, and what comes next to completely transform how we understand power, value, and survival in a world that has just been reset. When we observe those first hours of economic silence, an inevitable question looms like a growing shadow. What could really trigger such an absolute global collapse? The hidden truth behind the apparent stability, is that the global financial system has always depended on three fragile pillars: technology, geopolitics, and corporate trust. And any significant crack in one of these points can trigger an unstoppable chain reaction. Now, I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because understanding these triggers is understanding the anatomy of a crisis capable of completely reshaping our mindset about value, security, and the future. Imagine, for example, a simultaneous failure in digital banking systems. Not a simple bug, not an isolated interruption, but coordinated destabilization of infrastructures that operate global payments, clearinghouses, and critical liquidity networks. In a world totally dependent on instant transactions, a cyber attack of unprecedented scale or structural failure in widely used protocols will be enough to paralyze the financial flow. And when the flow stops, everything stops too. Companies can't pay suppliers, governments lose access to reserves, markets are blinded, trust disappears before anyone even understands what happened, and the psychological impact spreads faster than any data. It is in these invisible backstage areas that a new reality begins to take shape. Now consider the geopolitical rupture between superpowers. Prolonged tension, open conflict, or even a strategic stalemate involving energy, data, or technology can reignite rivalries that were already latent. When superpowers clash, the global economy ceases to be a collaborative ecosystem and becomes a battleground. The fragmentation of trade routes, the suspension of multilateral agreements, and the creation of restricted economic zones initiate a journey of instability that quickly contaminates emerging markets, regional currencies, and essential supply chains. Although it seems distant, one only needs to observe historical moments to realize how decisions made behind closed doors can redefine entire economic borders. And, in a modern context, with highly interconnected systems, the domino effect will be almost immediate. But perhaps the most underestimated trigger lies in megacorporations. Companies with trillion-dollar valuations, responsible for logistics, energy, data, and payments, today operate as the backbone of the global system. If one of them were to face a sudden liquidity crisis, a profound accounting scandal, or an operational collapse, the contagion would spread exponentially. Suppliers would halt deliveries, investors would withdraw capital, consumers would lose access to critical services, and the shock would cross borders with the speed of an electronic pulse. The extreme dependence on private networks creates a vulnerability that few like to admit. Sometimes, the fall of a corporation can have a greater impact than the fall of an entire country. These three scenarios, digital failure, geopolitical disruption, and corporate contagion, do not act in isolation. They silently connect, building a base of instability that remains imperceptible until something too small to predict triggers the sequence. And it is precisely this interdependence that transforms a local crisis into a global collapse. It is not only the system that crumbles, but the perception of security that shapes human behavior. It is at this point that individual and collective decisions begin to directly influence the course of events, revealing how much we are part of this machine. When we observe this set of possibilities, we begin to understand that the world economy wouldn't collapse in a single instant by chance. It would fall, because each hidden layer of the system already carried enough tension to trigger something bigger. And realizing this isn't about fearing the future, but about seeing the real impact of the choices that entire societies have been making over the last few decades. Every technological advance, every political alliance, every corporate expansion has shaped the terrain where this type of disruption can happen. And as this awareness deepens, new questions naturally arise, opening space for even broader analyses of what might happen after the trigger is pulled. Comment below, that makes sense to me. When the trigger finally manifests and the global structure begins to lose its grip, something profound happens in the first 72 hours. The world enters a state of silence that is unnatural, unexpected, and unlike any recorded crisis. It's a different kind of silence, almost physical, as if the absence of transactions, data, and prices creates a perceptible vacuum in the air. The economic collapse doesn't appear as noise, but as a sudden interruption of everything that previously seemed to flow naturally. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because it is in this initial interval that the transformation truly begins, and understanding these moments is fundamental to grasping the logic behind an alternate future. When international transactions are paralyzed, The first global reaction is an attempt to reconnect systems. Central banks send repeated signals to financial networks that no longer respond. Payment platforms enter contingency mode, trying to communicate with servers that have simply ceased to exist within the market architecture. Traders, accustomed to interpreting minute variations in real-time charts, face static screens, as if time had been suspended. This freeze is more than technical. It's psychological. Without prices, there is no reference point. Without a reference point, there is no decision. And when decisions cease to be possible, the emotional impact spreads more forcefully than any official warning. The first disruptions appear in logistics. Trucks are stopped not because of a lack of drivers, but because companies can't validate payments. Ships are held up in ports, awaiting authorizations that never arrive. Air routes are suspended due to lack of insurance, fuel, or international coordination. The global economy was built on continuous movement of goods. And when that movement ceases, the world discovers the true fragility of its interdependence. It is at this point that scarcity gives its first signs, still discreet, but enough to initiate a massive shift in mentality. Suddenly, what was abundant becomes uncertain, and what was trivial regains importance. The energy supply follows a similar pattern. It's not that the sources disappear. It's the support chain that collapses. Power plants await financial transfers. Transportation companies halt deliveries. Distribution centers operate blindly, without demand forecasts or payment capacity. What should illuminate cities begins to fail unpredictably. Entire regions experience intermittent outages that alter perception of security. It's as if the infrastructure is revealing its inner workings for the first time, showing how each wire, each contract, and each synchronization depends on something as abstract as trust. Food shortages soon follow, not because there is no production, but because the link between producer and consumer simply breaks down. Markets are not replenished. Businesses close due to a lack of price benchmarks. And when the population realizes that the logic of money no longer suffices, a physical race for real goods begins. Water, basic foodstuffs, medicines, fuels, all come to represent tangible value in a world that has lost its traditional valuation metrics. People who had never thought of stockpiling anything begin to act on instinct, guided by a mixture of fear, anticipation, and need. It is an emotional journey that exposes a hidden truth about our dependence on continuous flow. Without it, everyone seeks anchorage in what they can touch. As those 72 hours progress, an almost paradoxical feeling emerges. The collapse isn't noisy. It's slow, dense, prolonged. It spreads like a fog that fills every gap, until each individual realizes they are not just experiencing a temporary disruption, but entering another layer of reality, a layer where improvisation, adaptation, and quick decisions become essential. And yet, behind this initial chaos, there is a silent rhythm guiding every event, as if the system were undergoing an inevitable process of reconfiguration. At this stage, the world still doesn't know how to react. Governments are trying to issue vague statements. Corporations are trying to reorganize operations. Families are gathering to understand what is really happening. And amidst this lack of answers, a collective feeling is beginning to take shape. The perception that we are crossing an invisible boundary, a point of no return that redefines not only the present, but also all projections about the future. The most curious thing is that, even in the face of the unknown, something within each person begins to awaken, an ancient instinct, a forgot capacity to create alternatives when the main path disappears. And it is precisely at this intersection between collapse and reinvention that the scenario becomes even more revealing, as if we were about to understand layers of the system that had never been exposed before. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. When those first 72 hours reveal the structural fragility of the system, something even deeper begins to move behind the scenes: the states. While the population tries to understand what is happening, governments enter internal cycles of analysis, dispute, and improvisation. There is no manual, no global protocol for a simultaneous collapse, and that is precisely why the reactions begin to diverge brutally. Countries with strategic reserves try to contain the panic by maintaining calculated speeches, while more vulnerable nations are forced to make quick, often impulsive decisions to preserve a minimum of order. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is in this process of unequal reaction that the seed of a new geoeconomic map is born, a map that looks nothing like what we know today. In some regions, governments are choosing to close borders, believing that temporary isolation can delay the internal impact. In others, there is an attempt to form emergency alliances, connecting countries that previously barely communicated, but now see unity as a chance for survival. These improvised coalitions begin as fragile, almost experimental pacts, but quickly become the basis for something larger. It is a silent transformation, driven by both desperation and opportunity. No one wants to admit it publicly, but every leader has already realized that the old monetary order will not return intact. And by accepting this, they open space for negotiations that would previously have been politically unthinkable. Behind the scenes, economic teams work tirelessly to try and reactivate liquidity mechanisms, but the absence of a functional financial system makes any strategy an exercise in trial and error. When national currencies lose their benchmark, a race to create alternative instruments emerges. Some states try to resurrect old standards backed by commodities. Others rush to develop their own digital currencies, believing that more decentralized architecture could bring temporary stability. The hidden truth, however, is that none of these movements stems from conviction, but from necessity. When the world loses its traditional metrics, each country tries to write its own formula for survival. And while this is happening, new blocs are beginning to form. Countries that dominate energy join forces with those that have industrial capacity. Nations with advanced technology seek partners with natural resources. These are not ideological alliances. They are pragmatic alliances. They are pacts of continuity. This rearrangement creates unexpected tensions and rapprochements, altering the global narrative of power. Historians have observed similar phenomena in regional collapses. When an economy falls, its neighborhood reacts by creating parallel structures to compensate for the impact. But for the first time, we are facing something unprecedented, a simultaneous collapse on a planetary scale. Extrapolating this regional pattern to the global level reveals a scenario where economic blocs multiply rapidly, shaped by strategic affinity, geographical proximity, or, sometimes, pure instinct for self-preservation. And it is from this movement that the outline of an alternate future. In this new landscape, countries that were previously considered secondary are now taking on leading roles. The absence of a dominant currency opens the door to the creation of hybrid systems, improvised combinations of digital assets, physical resources, and multilateral agreements. Even the major powers are forced to negotiate on terms they would never have accepted before, because the collapse has temporarily leveled the playing field and exposed everyone's vulnerability at the same time. The mentality of absolute competition is beginning to give way to a logic of shared survival, albeit one permeated by distrust and silent disputes. What is most striking is how, in such a short time, the planet goes from a relatively stable international system to a fragmented, constantly changing landscape. Every decision made by states in this initial period reverberates for decades, shaping economic borders, redefining alliances, and creating new hierarchies of influence. Even countries that try to remain neutral end up being pulled to one side or the other, like smaller pieces attracted by the gravity of larger blocks in formation. It is the inevitable revelation that, in a globalized world, no one falls alone, and no one rebuilds alone. And as these forces reorganize, something begins to take shape behind all the tensions and improvisations. The global perception that a new monetary system needs to emerge, not as a continuation of the old one, but as a direct response to failures that led to the collapse. This movement is still confused, fragmented, full of internal disputes, but it is already possible to see the first outlines of an order being hastily built, sustained by urgency and the need for minimal stability. It is a complex journey, and each step reveals more about the profound impact of this collapse than any theoretical model could predict. Comment below. That makes sense to me. As these new blocks begin to form and the geopolitical landscape rapidly reorganizes, a second movement emerges, less visible, yet even more transformative: the spontaneous creation of alternative economies, not because someone planned it, but because, faced with the absence of a functional system, communities, megacities, and even corporations are forced to reinvent their forms of exchange. And this reinvention doesn't happen uniformly. It arises from chaos, urgency, and the need to continue existing in a world where the old monetary logic no longer suffices. Now I want to delve even deeper into the subject, because it is during this period that the true turning point occurs, and humanity begins to operate with a completely different mindset, guided by instinct, creativity, and extreme pragmatism. In urban areas, the collapse of large financial infrastructures creates a space where neighborhoods and districts begin to develop their own valuation methods. Local markets become points of reference, functioning as micro-centers of exchange where physical goods take center stage. Rice, fuel, medicine, tools, everything acquires a real value based on immediate utility, not on digital codes or abstract indicators. It is curious to observe how, when global structures disappear, collective thought retreats to something simpler and at the same time more human: direct exchange. People who previously depended exclusively on the formal system rediscover improvised solutions, and this change in mentality reveals how much society is capable of adapting when confronted with the hidden truth of its own vulnerability. Meanwhile, megacities are becoming accelerated laboratories for economic experimentation. With high population density and access to residual technology, they are beginning to create hybrid models, mixing old digital signatures, community credits, temporary tokens, and even local currencies issued by makeshift consortia. Urban transport companies are starting to accept energy vouchers. Food cooperatives are creating their own registration standard. Decentralized platforms are emerging as an attempt to organize scarce data. It is not an order, but a mosaic of solutions, a collective journey that mixes instability and innovation in almost equal proportions. And then comes an element that changes everything: AI. Even with central systems collapsing, isolated networks survive, running on distributed servers, private facilities, and independent centers. These artificial intelligences, previously used only to optimize supply chains or predict consumer behavior, are now playing a completely different role, that of arbiter. Because they can analyze large volumes of residual data, detect patterns, and reorganize flows, they are quickly becoming the most reliable tool for calculating scarcity, determining logistical priorities, and suggesting efficient routes for distributing resources. For the first time, critical supply decisions are not coming from central banks, multinational corporations, or governments, but from algorithmic systems that operate without emotional, political, or ideological interference. This creates a powerful contrast. On one side, absolute chaos. People trying to survive, communities improvising exchanges, countries vying for influence. On the other, a silent core of innovation, where emerging digital structures attempt to organize the disorganized, almost as if the system itself were seeking its own reconstruction. Corporations that manage to maintain some technological infrastructure begin to operate their own economic ecosystems, something close to corporate microstates, where access to energy, data, or transportation functions as internal currency. And, in many cases, these corporate networks become more stable than the governments themselves. The rise of parallel currencies is inevitable. Some places create alternative physical currencies. Others establish energy-based standards, such as kilowatt hours, and still others bet on digital tokens backed by local resources. Each of these initiatives attempt to fill the void left by the previous system, but none of them emerges with the intention of becoming dominant. They simply exist because they need to exist. The world enters a state of constant experimentation, and this mix of attempts reveals a profound impact that such a collapse generates on human behavior. When there are no rules, everyone creates their own. AI, in turn, is beginning to organize fragments of information scattered across the planet. In some places, algorithms can predict logistical bottlenecks with enough accuracy to prevent local humanitarian crises. In others, they help define dynamic prices based on real availability. And in certain isolated locations, they assume the role of coordination between communities and corporations, functioning as impartial intermediaries. It's as if we are witnessing the birth of a new type of economy, an AI-driven economy, in which traditional logic gives way to frameworks driven by data, collective behavior, and resource flow. This process doesn't eliminate chaos, but it creates cracks of order within it, cracks that allow people, groups, and cities to find a way to continue. And at that point, the world is no longer just reacting to collapse. It's building something different, something that blends improvisation and technology instinct and calculation, survival and innovation. A primitive but real sketch of an alternate economy that may very well become the basis for future global models. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. As these new alternative economies begin to take shape, something even more revealing unfolds before our eyes. Time. Because although the collapse happened abruptly, the reconstruction, or reinvention, emerges gradually, almost organically, as if each passing year reveals a different layer of this global transformation. At first, everything seems improvised, fragile, temporary, but one only needs to observe the movements from a distance to realize that a new type of order is emerging. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this timeline is to understand how entire societies reshape their mentality when forced to live without the structures that previously defined their choices, their patterns, and even their economic identities. In the first year after the collapse, the world achieved something that could be called partial stabilization. It's not true stability. It's just the feeling that the worst is over. Parallel currencies continue to circulate, local systems consolidate, and the fragmentation of the old financial system becomes irreversible. Large banks that survived cease to operate globally and begin to act as regional institutions. Countries that manage to organize their own digital networks create temporary transaction platforms, while others depend almost exclusively on barter economies and community vouchers. The psychological impact also changes. If in the first weeks the feeling was one of free fall, now a kind of pragmatic acceptance emerges. People get used to living with uncertainty, develop new routines, and create solutions that previously seemed extravagant or even impossible. Behind the scenes, governments are still trying to negotiate some form of reconnection, but they realize that the idea of a single system is increasingly distant. 5 years later, the scenario is different. The initial fragmentation evolves into specialization. Megacorporations that have managed to maintain robust technological infrastructure begin to operate as almost sovereign entities. They control energy, data, transportation, and logistics, creating functional territories in the form of networks, not borders. At the same time, autonomous cities emerge that adopt hybrid governance models, where decisions are made by human councils with full AI support or by algorithms that manage everything from resource distribution to local trade agreements. These urban centers become hubs of innovation and relative security, attracting people seeking predictability amidst the chaos. And it's impressive how these cities take on their own characteristics, as if they were living organisms, each testing its combination of digital economy, smart contracts, and scarcity policies managed by artificial intelligence systems. The hidden truth that emerges at this stage is simple. Stability, when it appears, no longer comes from nation-states. It comes from networks. And so we arrive 20 years after the collapse. The old global economy no longer exists, not even as a working memory. It exists only as a historical reference. In its place, entirely new structures emerge. Economic systems based on data flows, real-time scarcity metrics, and dynamic currencies that automatically adjust according to collective behavior. The futuristic world economies are not organized by territory, but by connectivity. It is common for individuals to belong simultaneously to more than one economic system, choosing networks according to their needs, values, and opportunities. Some networks prioritize efficiency, others sustainability, others emotional stability. The distinction between government enterprise and community becomes blurred. In some regions, corporations replace states. In others, AI systems govern consortia cities. In still others, self-managed networks operate as closed ecosystems. This transformation creates a dramatic historical contrast. In just 2 decades, humanity abandons the idea of a centralized global economy and begins to live within multiple simultaneous economic realities. The journey, which began with fear and improvisation, now reveals itself as a sequence of collective decisions and silent adaptations that, when observed in retrospect, seem almost inevitable. Each choice, each attempt at reorganization, each mistake, and each innovation contributed to shaping a completely new order. An order that works not because it was planned, but because it emerged from collapse as a natural consequence of necessity. Looking at this 20-year timeline, it becomes clear that this is not just about recovery. It is about a profound transformation, capable of redefining our relationship with value, power, work, and even identity. What seemed impossible in 24 hours becomes reality in 2 decades, and what seemed stable for centuries crumbled in a few days. But there is something even more intriguing in this process, something that cannot be ignored. The way these networks and systems come to influence, control, and even guide human behavior. Comment below, that makes sense to me. When we observe the trajectory over 1, 5, and 20 years, we begin to perceive something that wasn't evident at the beginning. The collapse wasn't just a destructive event, but profound, almost surgical, reboot of how humanity understands value, power, and social organization. It's curious how, looking back, everything seems to follow a silent logic, as if each stage of this journey had pushed the world toward a kind of unexpected clarity. The destruction of the previous system opened space for revelations that had been hidden for decades, perhaps centuries. Truths that only emerge when the structures that sustain them finally crumble. And it is precisely when this perception settles and that something else begins to take shape, not on the political or economic plane, but on the psychological one. Now I want to go even deeper into the subject, because understanding this emotional and symbolic layer is essential to understanding what it truly means to live in an alternate timeline. As people adapt to these new economies, a shift in mindset emerges that cannot be measured by graphs or indicators. It's as if humanity has crossed an invisible portal, leaving behind total dependence on centralized systems and discovering, almost instinctively, that the collapse was also an opportunity for internal reorganization. The hidden truth is that much of the limitations that define the old world stem more from collective beliefs than from the structures themselves. And when those beliefs crumbled along with the global financial system, space opened up for new interpretations of value: time, energy, data, collaboration, trust. The impact of this transformation is so profound that, 2 decades later, it is no longer possible to distinguish where practical adaptation ends and emotional reconstruction begins. Governments, corporations, and communities continue to compete for space, but now in a completely redesigned field, where authority is no longer inherited, but rather earned through the ability to generate stability, transparency, and meaning. AI systems are taking on roles previously exclusive to human institutions. But this not only creates distance, it also creates new forms of partnership, where complex decisions are shared between algorithms and people. And it is precisely in this hybrid relationship that a question arises, echoing silently among experts and citizens. Are we approaching a more balanced era or merely reorganizing old inequalities into new formats? This doubt stems not from pessimism, but from honesty, because even after 20 years of transformation, the world remains divided between regions that flourish within futuristic world economies and regions that struggle to keep pace. And yet, there is something that connects them all, the feeling that the collapse was not just the end of the system, but the beginning of a collective reflection on the kind of future we are willing to accept. And this is where the narrative returns to the central point, the one that has always been behind the simulation, guiding every revelation and every insight. If the global economy were to collapse tomorrow, what exactly would be reborn in its place? Would it be a more just decentralized and collaborative society, shaped by conscious decisions and intelligent networks? Or an even more fragmented landscape, where survival depends on the ability to adapt too quickly to structures that few truly understand? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer, but it does demand presence. It requires each person to look inward and recognize that the future is not something that simply happens. It is built, often in the shadows, from small choices that accumulate until they become irreversible. In a scenario collapse, these choices become even more visible, even more decisive, because each decision directly influences a collective trajectory. And that is why, even within this dystopian panorama, there's a thread of hope, the possibility of conscious reconstruction. In the end, everything converges on the same reflection. If the world economy fell tomorrow, would humanity rebuild a fairer system or a more fragmented one? The answer lies less in systems and more in the people who sustain them, in the mindsets that are formed, and in the values that choose to remain when everything that was solid no longer exists. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, you may have felt that this journey wasn't just a simulation, but a way of seeing the world with different eyes. And honestly, that's what motivates me to continue creating these scenarios, these reflections, and these possibilities. So, If this content resonated with you, if it touched on something you might not even have known was there, consider subscribing to the channel. That's what keeps this conversation alive. What gives us space to delve deeper into topics that almost never appear in common discussions, but that silently shape the future we will live in. And since you've walked with me to the end, leave a comment writing, "I'm with you until the end." That way I know who is truly present in this reflection until the very last second. And believe me, that connection matters more than you can imagine. If you'd like to leave a like, it helps this content reach those who are looking for exactly this kind of perspective, this kind of question that doesn't usually have an immediate answer, but opens up ways to think about the world in a different way. And of course, if you want to continue along this line of reasoning, there's a video here that complements this conversation and delves even deeper into this idea of possible futures. Click and stay with me there. We still have a lot to explore.